Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 34 of The Painter and the Pixie. I am your host, Serena Vassar, and joined by my husband, Jeremy Vassar.
Hello.
Our co-host here for the podcast. Today's episode is awesome. We are talking with my friend, Susan Carpenter. She's a licensed clinical social worker and a really great therapist. She's done a lot of really great work. She has a private practice and works with a group practice as well. It's a fun episode. We talk a lot here about connections, having healthy relationships, healthy connections with people, and then what it's kind of like to not have healthy connections, kind of bringing it back around. This is episode, what number of our When Shit Hits the Fan, A Guide to Personal Crisis?
I think this is number 5.
Number 5, I think.
Of the series. Yeah. So.
And it's great because it helps us to get through the personal crisis. You need to have connections and a sense of community. And we have had a lot of great episodes, and this one I think is one of my favorites.
Yeah, this one was definitely one of my favorites. I thought we covered a lot of good stuff, and a lot more about kind of being proactive.
Yeah, being proactive.
So that when personal crisis does happen, you've got a little bit more resilience in those experiences and how to kind of establish those healthy connections that you can then lean on when the crisis does happen.
Yeah, that's great. And I love that because this is the whole point of this series, this mini-series here, is to prepare yourself for personal crisis.
Right,
so being proactive rather than reactive.
Right.
So give the show a listen. I think you guys will like it.
Yeah. So without further ado, y'all enjoy episode number 34 of The Painter and the Pixie.
This is only the beginning.
All right, ready?
Ready?
What you're going to hear about today is nothing short of a miracle.
Well, I don't believe it.
Let's find out. Ready, set, go.
Yo, Susan Carpenter, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, hanging out with two of my favorite people, Susan and my wife Serena. And so before, I'm sure I will have mentioned some things in the intro as far as who you are, but I thought I would give you a chance just to
Share with our audience.
Yeah, give our listeners a little look at who you are and why it is that we're talking to you. So.
Well, I am privileged to be your friend.
So there's that. Yeah.
There's that. And I have a personal interest in mental health issues. Have my own history as well as I'm a therapist. I'm a licensed clinical social worker.
Okay.
And I'm also pursuing being certified in EMDR. Yeah. I work in a community behavioral health situation, and I also have a private practice in Quakertown.
Okay, and what's EMDR for those?
EMDR is a therapy approach to help people resolve issues of trauma, and it stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing, which is a huge mouthful.
Yeah,
but
I guess that's why we say EMDR.
See, I knew it was the I one, but I forget what the initials stood for. So
yeah, I wish they would change it, but it is what it is.
Yeah. Well, the important thing is that it exists and it works. So that's probably the most helpful portion of it.
Very helpful.
So, and you're entering into our towards the end of our When Shit Hits the Fan series, a guide to personal crisis, and I know you have helped counsel many people through their own personal crises. Is that how?
Crises.
Crises, right?
Mm-hmm.
It sounds weird when you add a lot of the S's. You and Serena have been chatting and put forth some. We're going to be talking about some kind of crisis in the midst of the social context and connections and things. And you're actually one of the most prepared guests I've ever seen
it's great.
on all the podcasts I've done. We have handouts. I'm very pumped. So,
it's a very important subject for me. And I feel a sense of responsibility to bring as much as I can to people. And the other part is if I'm not prepared, then there's really nothing.
Yeah, right. You got to know where you're going in order to get there.
Yeah. So I really wanted to bring as much information as I could.
Well, I appreciate it. I don't want to jump ahead, but I saw some references to books that I'm really happy about. Some I just read. So yeah.
Great. Good.
But so where would you like to kind of start off?
Well, I wanted to start off maybe just to talk a little bit about why my passion. I had to think about what subject I wanted to talk about, so I had to tap into what really means something to me. And I think that usually what really means something to us is where we've been, and back to Diane Wagenhall's also what's happened to us.
Yeah.
So over 30 years ago, I had gone through my own personal crisis, and a series of things, losses. I know you talked to Diane last week about losses and grief. Losses, I was going, a divorce situation, depression, anxiety, which I think we can all relate to at some point.
Yeah, all the fun things.
Some PTSD thrown in there. And that leads you into a situation often of feeling very isolated and very alone. And that word loneliness really strikes a chord with me. At one point, I remember feeling such a depth of loneliness that I felt like it was an organ in my body. It felt that real. So, what do you do when you're in that personal crisis? I realized that, we're talking today about people and connection and also disconnection.
Yeah.
And so when you're in that place, you're really at the bottom. Yes, I did have a couple people, but there were many hours in a day. And because of the my unique situation, I really experienced that real deep disconnection and how to find your way out. And I also found that through very, very gradual steps, over time, found my way out. But I learned a lot of lessons in finding that depth of despair. And, and now I feel a lot of hope, because that was back in the, the 80s. But today, neuroscience, and conversation, research about how the brain changes, how we can heal, how certain approaches can really help, and how social connection can really benefit people. So, I feel very committed, and I am so inspired by the people I see in my practices, and just people, people.
Yeah. Well, and that has to be a really powerful kind of experience for you to leverage, that you've kind of been to the dark lands and then found your way out, where you're counseling people that are in the midst of their own crisis, and you're like, I've heard this kind of gone back and forth between, is it better to have a counselor or a therapist that has had a traumatic history, or, someone who's been through a similar thing, or is it better to have someone who's not had a trauma history and still knows the techniques and stuff? So it's just interesting to see how different people approach it. And I really think it matters of, how well that, you've come out of your own crises, and how, healthy you've gotten. It's like if I was in that situation and seeing a therapist, it would just seem like that would be really helpful to be like, I know that you've been where I am, and you've found your way out.
Found the way out.
And that's super powerful, particularly I don't know. Just, it's a nice thing to leverage.
Yeah.
If you have anything to add to
that. I think that's a really great contribution to this conversation about personal crisis and what do you do, because we don't talk about that very often, this sense of deep loneliness. When you're in the midst of personal crisis, your crisis, or if you're helping someone you love through crisis, it can be extraordinarily lonely.
Yeah.
You feel like you're in this ice block all by yourself. What can you do? It's one thing to be able to say, use some of the skills we've covered in our previous episodes, okay, do the practical steps. What's the next thing you have to do? But if you're totally alone, you have no sense of relationship or connection. How do you get through that? How do you cultivate that? How do you bring yourself to get to the other side?
That's and that's where we're going
and
today.
That's where we're going today.
Yeah.
I think it's very valuable. Thank you.
yeah, absolutely. And I also see that, most people that go into this field have a story. I think it's unusual when somebody doesn't. They have a heart for that. And I also, I might tell someone I'm seeing that I'm a trauma survivor, or if there's a a sense of just saying, you know, I know what PTSD looks like. Beyond bringing that much, I don't really, you know, disclose more than that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I
Yeah.
don't know if you need to, but
No.
having that sense of, oh, okay, so you've been somewhere and you got out and I'm somewhere, you can help me get out too.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
There was there's an illustration, I cannot remember for the life of me where I got this from, but it was the sense of if you know, a friend and someone close, someone you love is kind of, they've fallen down that well of, you know, despair and grief and, you know, depression, anxiety, all of that stuff. You know, you jump in there with them and they're like, oh, have you been here before? And it's like, no, but I know the way out. And that was like the, you know, sometimes that's how you have to like come alongside someone through
Yeah.
relationship and
Yeah.
things like that. And sometimes you don't quite know the way out, but you're like, we'll figure
Well,
it out
we're going
together.
in the right direction.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You've got it.
Yeah.
So,
That's
but
exactly right.
what you were touching on, the deep loneliness, I think is a really, that's a troublesome part of the crises that you see. It seems to be isolating when, from what I've seen from like books like Lost Connections, which I know you might mention in the future here, is that you really want to like reach out when you're in a crisis, but it seems counter to how you would be feeling at the moment. It's almost like counter to almost the instinct of, you know, Diane talked about the responses to fear. The fear response, the first one really should be crying out for help. And that's in the context of a social situation. I feel like if you're getting into crisis, that's probably a good move.
Yeah.
I don't know how you feel
Right,
about that.
right. And I can see that. I mean, you get into a place, you're in deep waters, you need help. And yet at the other extreme, you know, you tend to shut down, close in. But yeah, we want people to call out for help and cry out for help for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to throw in, something out there. This is not a big definition, but since we're talking about social network of support, very simply, it's really, you know, including family, friends, peers, just other people. But at the same time, I thought too, as Diane with her pads and different things, I thought, you know, for listeners, it's probably really important right now as we're going to be moving forward with some of these different topics to consider your own sense of safety and taking that we would reach out and take care of you right now and support you, and just for listeners to be noticing how they're feeling during this podcast, maybe to take a break, you know, get a drink of water.
Yeah.
I encourage water. You know, take some deep breaths and come back, you know, because I think that's really important, safety.
Yeah, having a good
Agreed.
safety plan. If you
Absolutely.
get feeling overwhelmed or anything like that, you can
Hit
always
pause, come
pause
back
it,
later.
come back, maybe go watch a Disney movie, whatever you gotta do. Yeah.
So Jeremy, you mentioned that, you know, as I'm talking in my practice and in my personal connections with people, you know, somebody calls you or somebody comes to you with a crisis, and there you are, you're having a conversation, and if the crisis is really serious, you know, someone may need to go to the ER, you know, call someone, get some immediate help. But, you know, after you're off the phone, you know, I'm in a room and they're out there.
Yeah.
People need a network before they're in a crisis, ideally. You know, I often think about, you know, a chair. You know, a chair has legs on it. A chair doesn't stand up with one leg. It doesn't even do very well with two.
Yeah.
It's 3 or 4 are preferable.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's kind of like that. They need people out there. And the other part is when you look at the first steps in like a psychological first aid, one of the first steps is for the people that are helping to connect, make sure people are connected to their network of support. It's just, you know, really important part of it.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, you can have all the knowledge to get through a personal crisis ever in the world, but if you don't have people with you to help you actually get through the crisis, different story.
Yeah, absolutely.
So is that something as a therapist, if you're, you have do you call them clients?
I reluctantly call people clients. It sounds, some people call them consumers, which I'm more reluctant.
Consumers seems worse.
It seems worse. I guess technically they're clients. Sometimes I just seem to resort to people I see or people I know.
They're my people.
They're my people. They are my people.
I like the people you see.
I like the
that's
people
nice.
I see.
Yeah,
I may not be able to say all that as we go along, but it really is people I see.
Yeah. So in that sense, in a more, I'll say in like a professional setting, if they're coming to you with a crisis, one of the things that you would focus on is connecting with their support network.
Yeah.
Kind of like as one of the first steps to help them through, like, who's in your family right now, who can you depend on, things like that. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. What helps you, knowing what helps you, sometimes we develop a little plan for such a situation. What can you do? A couple of things you can do to help yourself calm down, which you've talked about. You're just distressing, self-soothing. When you're with people, what helps? Is it having them take you out? Is it talking? Is it listening? Is it being held? Is it being given space but knowing they're there? So everybody is really different. But for people to become aware of what actually helps them and how other people can help.
And I think you said this a moment ago, becoming aware, sort of developing thinking about those things before you get into a personal crisis is so helpful. So even those of our listeners right now, you can start developing, jot some notes down, think about it, type it in your phone, put it on a sticky note. Anything you want to say, okay, what would make me feel better if I'm in major stress? Would it be listening, calling someone to come listen to me talk, talking to someone, going out walking through the park? You can do this stuff right now while you're listening to the show. You can say, what's going to help me?
And that's really my aim, and Serena and my aim for this series is really to it's interesting to me what people will prepare for in their life. Like, I'm very interested in the concept of resilience and being like a robust human. And there's a guy that wrote a book called Anti-Fragile. He was one of the guys that predicted the economic collapse of 2008. He was one of the few guys that shorted everything and made gobs of money because he knew it was coming.
Wow.
But his book Anti-Fragile is basically talks about black swan events, that these are these cataclysms that happen in society that you can bank on them happening, like earthquakes and other natural disasters, things like 9/11. Those events are going to continue to happen, but few people kind of prepare for them.
Yeah.
And then he talks a lot about anti-fragile is kind of the same thing as resilience, where it's not only resilience that you can survive something like that, but that you're stronger on the other side because of the preparation you put in ahead of time.
Yeah. That's helpful.
And I'm sure you guys know of people like doomsday preppers and things like that, where it's
I know a few.
You kind of go a little bit hardcore that way of the zombie apocalypse, and you stock up food and ammunition and guns and bomb shelters and all these things. You can go down a rabbit hole that way. But what I have noticed is that not as many people are preparing for the things that are genuinely going to happen. We're all going to suffer personal losses. We're all going to have to grieve someone that we lost. There's going to be semi-predictable black swan events in everybody's personal journey.
Right,
and
you may not know when it happens, but you know that it is inevitable.
Yeah,
you will have a loss.
Yeah, you're going to have a loss. You're going to, even if it's in the normal kind of ebb and flow of life, you lose your parents, you have just all the things that happen in life, where sometimes it just blindsides people that they're not adequately prepared for. Particularly when it's like a combination of things, kind of like what you were saying earlier, where it was it's yours is a more extreme case, but it's a lot of things that feed into that make it like a big cataclysm in your life. So even for those that might not have a trauma history, you're going to have some more normative things that happen. They're going to be very distressing, but then can almost, if they're not considered ahead of time or prepared for, it might end up being an even more traumatic event than it would, need to be, really.
Right.
So, and that's kind of what we're so I'm really excited about this podcast particularly is that we're going to be kind of talking about how to have a little bit more robust network as you in preparation going into that. And that's a lot of, we did a podcast with my dad about how to cultivate healthy relationships. And that's like one of the most, like you said, you need 4 legs on a chair for it to stand.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of people are on wobbly legs or on maybe just one
or no
legs. So
or no legs.
There's basically no chair.
Yeah.
So.
Sitting on the floor.
Yeah, exactly. like us. Well, that's so true. And the other part is if you're trying to increase, let's say, your stability through building relationships, through some connections, there's an extra blessing. You might have a better sense of well-being and feel better physically, emotionally, and have a more enjoyment, quality of life.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Absolutely.
There's really no downside. Really.
There's no downside. Yeah. I have noticed in clients, in people I see, we'll go back to that again, that people that do not really have nurturing relationships, maybe really no one, or maybe one unhealthy relationship, are just not thriving. But I have noticed that people that, maybe I've seen them individually and then they become part of, I help to lead a women's group, a women's trauma group. Some of those same people that have then joined the women's group begin to thrive. And I actually watch amazing things happen because instead of that isolation, they're bringing it into relationship.
Yeah.
And finding out, connecting with other people, being part of a group, belonging. So that's been an amazing thing to watch.
Yeah. Makes a difference.
Makes a huge difference.
Sometimes people don't understand how much of a difference it can make.
Yeah.
Well, and it's we've talked to Diane a couple times now on this podcast, and she is, and Susan, you're very good friends with her as well. So, you know how deep she is in the world of trauma, and when you start talking to her, you're just like, dude, this is so complex. Who's like, how do we figure all this stuff out? But then when you break it down, a lot of the healing that takes place in recovering from trauma and crisis is through healthy relationships.
Yeah.
It's like the solution can be kind of simple as far as it takes place within the context of healthy relationships. I'm not saying it's simple, but it's I'm fascinated by that kind of portion of things. Some of the ingredients of the recipe are available.
Yeah.
They're all around us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we can talk also at maybe a little further about what gets in the way of people reaching out. I was really taken by a study. Robert Putnam, he's a Harvard professor, and he was documenting some trends of our time, and he noticed in a cross section of U.S. citizens, I guess maybe several decades ago, that if you ask people how many confidants they have, how many people do you have to turn to in a crisis or tell them about something good that's happened? Well, a long while ago, most people on an average would say 3. But he checked it again in 2004, which is still quite a while ago, and it was none.
What?
Oh.
There was a more recent statistic I heard that, 1 out of 5 Americans are chronically lonely. Now, that doesn't mean lonely once in a while. That means all the time. 1 out of 5.
That's a
That's
lot.
a lot.
That is a lot.
That's almost a quarter of the population.
Yeah, that's 20 out of 100.
That's very good math.
Yeah, right?
I didn't figure that one out. I'm not a math person. Yay, Serena. Yeah. So I thought, I did some more reading because as I was thinking about the importance of all this, I wanted to learn more too.
Yeah.
And just that we are really, the idea that neuroscience is showing us now how hardwired we are for connection, that we're made to connect. And, even they studied the idea of spiritual connection, but a psychiatrist named Kurt Thompson, wrote a book, Anatomy of the Soul. I don't know when he did that, but he found out that meaningful relationships with others makes our minds healthier and actually reconfigures our brain.
Yep. I believe that.
Changes it. And there was another study by a Dartmouth medical school, and I actually looked it up online today, and there's even a book by the title. The study was called Hardwired to Connect.
Oh.
Okay.
And they were really noticing that teens and children, they were studying the incidence and increase in mental health issues. And they found some things. They found out that excuse me, that we're really predisposed to connect, that there's a spike in oxytocin when there's meaningful connections. Serena's nodding.
Yep.
That leads to well-being and less aggression.
Yeah, absolutely.
It works. And, the good news is if you've been raised in a healthy home, I don't really know a lot of people, functional healthy homes. I'm not sure who and where they are, but, that with those early caregivers, parents, if there's a mutually healthy, satisfying connection, the brain, is wired around that. But if the opposite is true, it's gonna have harmful effects. But the good news is, what about if you didn't have this ideal, mutually caregiving, nurturing relationship when you were a little baby and a kid? Well, they did a monkey study. There's a lot of studies out there that, the unnurtured monkeys were put with the nurturing, better off monkeys, and consistently, and the unnurtured monkeys changed.
Yeah.
And they
for the better.
They
right?
got better. Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably their fur increased. But they got better. Yeah. They did better. And there's so much finding on that.
Well, it makes sense from a biological standpoint that, humans as primates, as highly social primates, that there's safety in numbers. If you're isolated and you're alone, then you're exposed to a lot more danger. You're exposed to predators, starvation. It's a lot easier to get food when you're together. So there's a lot of correlations behind, as soon as you are isolated and alone, like you generally, that's always where, even they've done studies where if you're alone and sleeping alone, like particularly outside, you're way more jumpy versus sleeping next to someone, and particularly someone you would have a good relationship with.
Probably even someone you don't have a good relationship
Yeah.
with, you probably react with less fear and less stress in that type of situation.
And humans get deeper sleep when they sleep around other people as well. So if you think like kind of maybe like a military setting, like army barracks, like generally those guys are getting deeper sleep because there's safety in numbers, versus if there was like a scout having to sleep out kind of on patrol, you're way more alert, and you will wake much quicker because you've got to be a little more on your toes, because you've got to be more alert. So there's safety in numbers, but that kind of, it expands out to because most people aren't living the hunter-gatherer lifestyle where you're kind of fending for your own, but those connections are so old. Those systems are still in place, so we still
very hardwired.
Very hardwired. And is the book you're talking
right.
about called Social?
You know what? I thought maybe there is a book called Social, but there was actually a book, I believe it's related to the study about the Hardwired to Connect. So maybe,
I think they mentioned that one too.
Okay.
'Cause, I remember hearing about that study. I'm pretty sure it was that book. But anyway.
But back to what you were saying, listen to this, that they did a study, a researcher named Jim Cohn, Coan, and thinking about, imagine you, Jeremy, out there all alone in a tent, right? And you hear something threatening. So he did a study on the difference between enacted support, meaning actual hands-on support, versus perceived support. So let's imagine.
Ooh, I like this.
Yeah,
I like
so
this.
it's so interesting. So let's imagine you're in your tent, right? And let's imagine Serena, if you don't mind, is in your tent, and Serena's there, and there's a threatening situation. Yeah. Now, when Serena's there, she's feeling alone and she feels like she's totally on her own in every way. But you, Jeremy, you bring up in your mind at that minute who your supports are. You kind of visualize, who your people are, maybe 5, 6 people in your head, and they're sort of with you. They're your perceived imagined support, and your response to that threat will be much less. Now, you might lose your life as well, but you'll die less stress.
That's good.
And we actually, one of my coworkers, we actually did this in one of our women's groups because people mostly came with a sense of feeling alone.
Yeah, and
so we, women went home with a list of people in the group, kept it close by in their pocket, their purse, and maybe first names. And we had some examples of women coming back, either imagining, when they felt nervous or hypervigilant or something like that. They brought up the image of the group and the perceived support, and they got through it much better.
Yeah,
That's
incredible.
The group members were like, we helped you. We got you through it,
Yeah.
So it's not even necessarily that they would help you in that moment, but that you kind of have
alone.
You've got a solid out. Like someone, my grandfather would call it, he always wanted a way off the beaches. That was his, but he was in 3 D-Day landings. So he legitimately wanted a way off of an actual beach. So he always would relate it back to that. Because he never wanted that feeling of being trapped. So if you have that kind of mental escape plan, that can just be calming, even if it's, I like that.
Already helpful.
Yeah.
It's really helpful.
Yeah.
I even used it myself at work. Sometimes I can go into work in a day and I might not see another therapist in larger practice where I am. And yet, there's 3 or 4 people that are my people. And let's say I come up with a really stressful situation. I'm not really alone because I'm still imagining. I might not see them for a month, but in my head, I know they're there. I'm not alone. They're with me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
from a nutritional therapy perspective, I can appreciate that as well because so many of my clients become successful. They come to see me and they say, I've been trying to get healthy for years. And even sometimes just knowing they can text me or call me or send me a message through Basecamp, that's enough. They know, someone's in my court, someone's got my back. They don't have to physically be present with me, but I know that support is still available to me.
That's great. That's right. And with that, in that situation when somebody doesn't have that kind of support, under stress, the hypothalamus releases stress hormones, particularly cortisol, which have a negative effect on people. So when your clients, your people, know that, you're there, that's going to reduce that stress response. That's great.
And the help is, it seems like it would help that the help is genuine.
Right.
It's not a, like a fantasy. Like you could actually pick up your phone and call one of those people, or you could go and knock on your colleague's door and get help with an issue, or
that's true.
Or, and I think that's what's nice about, technologies gets a bad rap sometimes for kind of diluting some of these connections, but everyone kind of has an oh shit box in their pocket, and if you do have the people that you can call,
the phone.
like their phone, so you can call whoever is in your network, or with your women's group, they can call their friends in the group, with your clients, they can actually call you, and contact you. So it's not like a fantasy. There's actually a receptive relationship on the other. It's like calling 911. Like someone's going to come.
Someone's going to be there.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly
and
it.
What? Sometimes knowing I can literally call 911 is enough support for some people.
Yeah.
I've worked with clients too in like more of a counseling setting, not in a nutritional counseling setting, and just knowing that's an option can be helpful.
Yeah.
So you have way off the beaches. It's a really extreme situation, but you're like, I know that if I really need help, you said this at the beginning of our episode, go to the ER. Like you have something.
Yeah.
Something's available. You're not completely
Not stuck,
100%
trapped,
alone, trapped at the bottom of the well.
Yeah, trapped's a good
It is.
word. I mean, even in like a, in a high pressure social situation, like if you're not comfortable in large crowds and you start getting, if you just have it in your head, like if it gets too much, I can just leave.
Yeah.
And even just telling yourself that's like, you kind of like worst case scenario, I can just bounce and then
I still have a way out.
you still have a way out.
Yeah.
And that's, you might not ever like kind of pull the
Right.
trigger on it, but it's there. So
And just thinking about what you guys have been talking about with the brain, when you sort of have a plan, maybe you have a name written down, a number, you're bringing the left side of your brain online, you've got a plan. It's real. And these relationships are not fantasies.
Right.
They're really out there.
Right.
yeah.
Bringing the left side of the brain online, but also to connect back to when we our brain state regulation podcast, it's almost the same thing. You can stay higher in the brain. You don't have to drop so far down where everything is just like shooting from the hip and nebulous and you're falling down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
You've got something to hold on to keep you at least limbic, if not black and white. You're like, there is something I can do about this.
Yeah, absolutely.
So helpful.
Yeah, because it can keep
So empowering.
It can give you a like a safety net or like a sense of calmness that like, okay, if things start going south, I'm only going to drop this far and then I'm
Right.
out.
Yeah.
So
Yay. That's good. So I thought maybe we could move towards a little bit. We've talked about a little bit about what are some of what gets in the way of connection,
Good
and
idea.
what is the disconnection about, what leads to that. And I think, Jeremy, you mentioned sometimes people are connected and then life happens, things happen, you lose somebody close to you, you relocate to a whole new area, maybe you lose a job, maybe you get a job. And as I've noticed, people that I see, and probably people maybe even yourselves at some point, depression, anxiety, any kind of mental health issues can cause us to kind of go inward, not go out. Some of the individuals I see and have experienced it, you begin to believe, if you don't care about yourself, who else does? Or I've been hurt so much by people, I don't want to get hurt anymore.
Yeah.
Or I don't know.
If I try to develop connection, I'll just get hurt again.
Yep. And there's a lot of that. And just, maybe trying to be with people and, your body is so wired, you're hyper, you can't get comfortable, or you kind of things feel like they shut down. That's not a very posiosive experience. Who wants to have that?
No,
right,
no one.
right. Well, it's like if you got bit by dogs when you were a kid, and then you now you're scared of dogs, like all dogs,
dogs,
and you're trying to establish a connection with, not all dogs are mean and will bite you. Like a lot of them are cool.
Yeah.
So, but it's if you have that imprint, then you're going to be it's going to be.
That's a good analogy.
It's something you've got to
think.
okay, I got to chill out. I know how to approach this dog. I know the different. So, but there's you got to be intentional about it, and I would imagine that's got to be tough when you transpose that onto humans, because it's
Yeah.
because humans are way harder to figure out than dogs.
And they're everywhere.
They are everywhere.
And they're everywhere.
So if you've, understandably, earlier in your life, you decided that humans, like dogs, are dangerous and it's not worth it, and avoid kind of a phobia and then avoidance. You've adapted. You've done that to survive, but later on, it gets in your way because people seem to be involved in everything. If you want to have fun, if you want to go out to a store, if you, just want to be out there, get a job, volunteer, enjoy maybe a hobby or something that you have. It's, that's why I think I've noticed some people will even reverse their sleep schedules, and they will decide to sleep all day and stay awake at night because everybody, it's quieter, it's safe.
Right.
Less chance of
And you
running
can
into
get
all
up.
those humans.
You can get up. I'm not advising that, but it makes sense because as Diane Wagenhals, and others have said so often, it's not about what's wrong with you. It's about what's happened to you.
And I think
those reactions.
And I think there's even more of that sense of danger associated with humans more and more, because I think that is one of the reasons why technology gets leveraged in a way where people will isolate themselves and just interact with people through a computer or through a tablet or a smartphone or whatever, because it's safer. I can control all of the inbound messages and all the inbound interactions because, it's all through this screen interface and typing and text.
There's some space. It's like you get bit by dogs, you go to a zoo of dogs. Like they're in a cage.
A zoo of dogs.
I don't know. They're away from you. You can see them. You can interact with them, kind of, a version of interaction.
Right.
But there's no way those dogs are coming out of those cages to get you.
Yeah.
That's right.
And
It's survival.
Yeah.
And again, I don't want to besmirch technology because I do think it can be used in a healthy way and actually help you establish healthy relationships.
When you have healthy connections and healthy,
Yeah.
you know how to do that. It can be fine. But
I just don't want to.
So, do you have any other thoughts on barriers too?
Well, some other ideas on barriers. I wanted to mention a little bit about Johann Hari.
Yeah.
And wrote the book Lost Connections, Discover the Real Causes of Depression and Unexpected Solutions. And like we talked about, when you have been through stuff, you tend to really, maybe that gives you more motivation to find out. So he became a social scientist, and he learned a lot. In his book, he talks about depression, anxiety caused by maybe some social problems with the way we live. So he followed a lot of studies. In the book, he really talks about his own experience, and he refers to a study by a research by a man named John, and I'm going to call it Cacioppo. How your life affects your brain. And there were several studies they did on body responses, cardiovascular. And also the studies ended up showing that when people feel lonely, very lonely, their cortisol levels spike. And he came up with a conclusion that feeling lonely was as stressful as experience a physical attack.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's really huge.
It really is. And here's one. I'll let you guess what you think happened, okay? So another study recorded with their subjects how many people had, healthy connections and friends, and then those people were exposed to a cold virus.
Oh, my goodness.
What do you think happened?
Well, I would imagine. Well, I've already read the book, so.
Oh, okay. Well, I have not. So I would
Let's
imagine that individuals who have more secure connections and healthier relationships either didn't get sick or didn't get as sick as those who did not have those relationships.
Well, you are right. 3 times people that were isolated. This is unbelievable, though. 3 times more people that were isolated were ready to or apt to catch the virus. Wow. Now here they are really alone, but their immune system, their body was not doing as well.
Yeah. Now, from a nutritional perspective, let's talk about this for a moment.
Sure.
With this high amount of stress hormone, cortisol, sometimes you move into epinephrine, I'm sure, which is the same thing as adrenaline. When you're in this lonely state, your body is kind of almost constantly stuck in sympathetic overdrive, which is fight or flight. And when that's the case, your immune system is weakened. All of your body's ability to do proper digestion. I know anybody of you listening, I talk about digestion all the time. Digestion's your first line of defense against pathogens like this. So if you're stuck in go mode, stress mode, we'll call it stress mode, and you've got all this cortisol, you're not going to digest your food appropriately. You're not going to digest and kill any pathogens appropriately, and you're much more likely to get this, sickness, this stress response. Whereas people who have connections and community and have that sense of almost happiness, they're not lonely, they're very fulfilled, you can be in rest mode more effectively. Rest mode, that's parasympathetic, the opposite of sympathetic. And parasympathetic is called rest and digest, but it's also where you do repair and detoxification and healing of the body happens in a parasympathetic state.
Wow.
And when you're lonely and you have all these stress hormones, there's no way you can get into that parasympathetic state. You can't fight off the virus. So it makes sense. I just never heard that side of it before like that.
And people I see, when they're sick, they get more depressed.
Yeah.
They really feel bad. Their window of tolerance has shrunk.
Well, it's interesting with the Lost Connections book, when he chronicled how when you're lonely, kind of what your body goes through, and when they did all these measurements, there's actually like a biological response and almost path of loneliness that leads all the way to death, where you're more susceptible to disease, and it's usually like paired with a loss of purpose. And if it's not checked at some point by your social network or your, I like the term social network because it has the word like net in it, almost like a safety net. That's really what stops you from spiraling all the way out. Where there are people that, you can have a complex series of events that isolates you, and then a lot of times that can lead to like, they're just depressed and more susceptible to disease. The immune system's compromised, and it almost is like a cell that has been isolated and then implodes on itself. There's like that,
Autophagy.
Yeah, autophagy. Thank you for that. Good pull.
Wow, a new word for me.
Yeah, that's when cells eat the sick cells.
Okay.
Make room for new cells.
So and it's kind of a similar mechanism of you're so isolated that that's one of the things that happens. But there's also like a more normative biological response is like if you have an injury, like as a particularly like say like hunter gatherer, we'll kind of put it back into that. Like if you're one of the hunters, you're one of the guys, and you go out and you say you have an injury to your leg and now you can't hunt. What it does, it'll like drop your testosterone, drops your drive, like because you'll get sad about the injury because you can't hunt anymore. And the biological response is so that it lessens your drive. It kind of calms you down a little bit, and then it limits the drive so that you want to stay closer to the tribe where you're safe. You're less mobile, less kinetic, and less busy, less doing things. But it's supposed to be in the context of the tribe that would kind of surround you and help you like nurse back to health. But it's like
So as a healthy, just make sure I'm tracking with you. A healthy context of this depression sort of reduction of energy state is supposed to be so you're drawn back into your healthy network of support.
It's supposed to limit your drive to wander.
So that you do come back to the place where
Correct.
you can be rebuilt and come back to health.
You want to stay centered around the tribe, so you don't like go off and do something more, particularly as males, something more stupid.
Dangerous.
They would get you then killed. Something very it makes
Come back to your safety net. I love how you said that.
Great.
like a better term would be like
either.
risk averse is what it starts making you less risky is a better term.
Okay.
And then once you recover, then it's supposed to like cycle back on. And then I think where our society gets stuck is that it just gets stuck on the downward spiral, and there's not that kind of like, but boom, I'm back and I'm back to doing the things that I do kind of a thing.
And they find that there is that downward spiral. You begin to become more fearful, more downward, and more suspicious, and you start to see things even more negatively.
Yeah.
So it just gets worse.
Yep.
I just think it's very interesting to me that through the you always help me out with this, the DSM.
Yeah, Diagnostic and Statistical
What
Manual.
number are they on now? 4 or 5?
Five revised.
So when they revised it, in Johan Hari's book, he talks about it, that they eliminated the grief clause.
They did.
So,
I know.
So like,
Terrible.
if you have someone close to you pass away and you're sad, they can put you on meds immediately.
Yeah.
You're classified as clinically depressed. Like,
Which is ridiculous
Like
because
what?
that's a natural grief process.
It's a healing process.
healing
Yeah.
so it's almost like no one should feel sad ever. It's like
Yeah.
there's a
Right.
Get back on track, guys. Come on.
it's a healthy biological response to an event, to something that happens. It's
Yeah.
so it's normative and,
Yeah.
and healthy. So and I think that's the stuff that super annoys me, because it's
Yeah.
almost like people think you should never be sad. I'm like, the world has some really sad stuff in it, man. It's all right. You gotta like figure out how to work through it, and that there's like a healthy way to handle grief and loss and all the things we're talking about. Sorry.
So we give you a different diagnosis just to get the insurance company on board.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So that you can get your meds
So you can
and
get your meds and everything else.
all these things.
So just to kind of, we've been using that word loneliness
Yeah.
a lot. In his book again, Hari, he says that, he raises the question, is feeling lonely different from being alone?
Oh, that's a good question.
So you can be in a public place and you're feeling lonely. You can be in a hospital bed. People are all around and you can feel lonely. So, you can be in Times Square and not know anybody and be
And feel very
extremely lonely. I remember one time several years ago being at a nice social gathering. People were being friendly, and I didn't feel connected to anyone. And I honestly felt more lonely there than I would have felt home alone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Do you think it's partly because you're observing people not being lonely?
Yeah.
Like you're almost watching it?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's true. They're having something you're not. And he talks about, so what is a way to bring an end to your loneliness? Well, one part of it is people, but what is it that you need in that relationship with people to have something satisfying? And I want to say what he says. He says, you need other people plus something else. You need to feel that you are sharing something with the other person or group that is meaningful to both of you. You have to be in it together. Now, you guys have your sweet little dog Gus.
Yeah.
And you're in it together and you're sharing that. And there's, that connection, mutual. And so it's mutual back and forth. And there's, that is a satisfying thing. And that's the opposite of what loneliness feels like. Loneliness, you could be in Times Square, but you realize at that moment, maybe even in your life, that you're not sharing something with
Right.
anybody
Right.
meaningful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I
And-
think having those shared meaningful experiences has been definitely how I've developed my most important relationships.
Yeah.
So, like my brother and I are very close, and we built a business together, and it was like problem solving with him over, like 15 years of working together, of just like a lot of reps of just solving these problems and working together and getting things done. And then we were also fight training together, and he was my training partner. So it was like figuring out how to
Lots of problem
a
solving.
lot of problem solving, a lot of things we really cared about, we worked on together. And that's like what really, it's not just that he's my brother that's why I'm close. It's because of all the shared experiences that we really cared about that we did together.
They were
as
meaningful to each other.
Yes, super meaningful. And, we did that where we both contributed. We were both figuring things out. And that's in the kind of the science of facilitating healthy connections. That's a huge one, is doing something together that you both care about. And that's, I think that's why a lot of people can have better connections with the people they work with than with a lot of the other relationships, because you
have a shared focus.
you have a shared focus, a shared mission. And if you're working on something that you care about, it can be even, it makes sense that they would be your friends, your people, because you're both, you're sharing that mission. That's why like a lot of military guys, their friends are also, in their unit or in the branch of the military that they're in, because it's like we're both working on this together. So, and I would assume that's true in most other areas as well.
Yeah. I would guess, your grandfather, if he talks about some of his comrades, they probably still live in his lived as he was alive, lived in his head, you know?
Yeah.
And you know, and that may be some of the closest relationships ever.
Yeah. Well, and
They got your back.
and particularly when
Yeah.
it's so extreme, like that's another whole situation. Is
Yeah.
like those. It's like you know, the military is a good example. But if you have guys that served in the same unit and you see them reconnect, it's like they just fall right back into
Yeah.
it. So,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you see a friend you haven't seen for a long time, and suddenly, you know, you're together, and it was like you never stopped being together.
Yeah.
You know, the deeper connection.
And usually what you hash out immediately when you see a friend you haven't seen in a while is you start rehashing the old things you did together.
Right.
That's like you're
That's true.
reigniting
Interesting.
those old connections that mattered to both of you.
Yeah.
Like a college buddy or whatever it is.
Absolutely.
Do you think I'm gonna throw this way back from the beginning of our conversation? Do you think that's why sometimes it feels better when you know that your counselor, therapist has been through something? It's almost a shared experience bond that you can have without divulging any information, just to know, and you've got that connection on a different level than with somebody who's just sitting there and you're like, you've been through nothing. You know a lot of stuff.
Right.
So that may be what's part of that draw.
Yeah, well, I would assume that it's something akin to like you can appreciate their perspective because it's real. But yeah, I don't. Anyway,
Well, and I see what you're saying, and I think that's true. And yet, I've also had experiences with counselors that I've gone to where I feel their empathy. I feel they're with me. Now, whether and I didn't know anything about their life,
Right.
but I felt that they really got it. And, you know, it's just more of a personal connection. So, but if they're sitting there with their arms crossed and sort of a cold blank stare, then that doesn't feel
Yeah.
quite as empathetic.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but you bring up a good point.
yeah, I'm
Depends
definitely.
on-
Yeah, I'm
I
definitely.
just thought about it.
Yeah, I'm the wrong person to ask that too. That's not my department. So.
So I wondered if we could talk a little bit about, we touched on it before, the subject of our culture and social media, because even some of the things we referred to, you know, people had more confidants before. Maybe they don't feel like they have anybody now.
Interesting.
So where does our culture, how is it now? You know, social media, people have all kinds of Facebook connections. They're doing things that I haven't even tried, that I probably won't try. But how does that play into this social network of support? And is there satisfaction in what people are getting, or is something missing?
Well, I'm
Good
glad
thing
you
to
asked,
play with.
Susan.
Yeah.
Great time to ask.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's something that I've given a lot of thought to. I'm actually be launching my own YouTube channel here in a little bit called The Media Diet, which is all about, much like Serena is into, you know, what you put in your mouth
Physical
with nutrition,
diet.
your physical diet.
Yeah.
You know, I'm very much concerned with bringing a level of awareness and intention behind how we engage with media. A lot of it is passive and it's just kind of inbound, and people, I think, aren't as intentional as they might be to develop. It's kind of like if you're not intentional about your food diet, you can eat a lot of junk and then you can be sick and not feel good and lead to all these other chronic issues. And with social media, I think there's a lot of good things that it comes, like we're getting more and more connected with people that are further and further away. That's a very interesting phenomenon. We have access to more information than we've ever had. You've got more, like right now in history, everyone has access to the most information ever accrued in their pocket
Yeah.
instantaneously, wherever you are. It's bananas. That's a new thing.
Yeah.
Which is like, now we're figuring out, well, like, how do you have healthy connections? There's a woman that wrote a book. I cannot remember her name, but the book was called Alone Together. And she's been writing a lot about how the social media and the internet has affected real life relationships. There's another book that a fella, I think from Harvard, wrote called Bowling Alone. So that's a real kind of famous one where people, like, bowling used to be a really communal activity, and now most people that bowl are doing it by themselves. And it's what I think social media can be good for. I'll give you like a super simple example. Like I'm thinking about joining the Bucks County running club, and they have a Facebook page. And now they chronicle all of their events on the Facebook page, like when they're training, when the races are, things like that. That is a useful form of social media where I'll, if I was a member of the group and wanted to train with them, I would check and see what the schedule is. I might type a question in the forum, get it answered by one of the, people in there. And then that group online is leading to an IRL and in real life interaction with people face to face, where now I'm doing an activity that everyone, like we said, sharing a meaningful experience with people that are sharing my interests. And now I'm, off doing a trail run with 20 other guys that are interested in training for an ultramarathon or whatever it is. Yeah. So that's a good use. But Serena and I've talked about this a bunch before. If your only social nourishment is coming from interactions with Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and any of that stuff,
social medias,
there's not a lot of meat in there. There's not a lot of nutritious social calories, we'll say. And it's much like getting the bulk of your nutrition from processed food. It's just not going to lead to good things. So that's kind of my take on it. But I think if you bring a level of intentionality behind your interactions with media, I think it can be a healthy thing. But the way that they set it up, it can be, they're trying to suck you in and keep you in those platforms as long as possible. And there are engineers designing it so that you don't leave. So
it's just like sugar.
Yeah, just like sugar.
Yep.
Yeah. And I one of the things in Hari's book again was that, those kinds of, if you're solely having those less face-to-face interactions, that you mentioned, your whole world is, all your connections are out there, just internet. It's similar to porn versus, having a lovely, sexual, meaningful relationship with a real person.
Yeah.
It just doesn't satisfy, maybe temporarily, maybe it's a distraction, maybe it brings temporary relief to whatever's going on. Maybe, as you said before, I think it was Jeremy, you said, it's managing the real world and your real life can be really incredibly difficult. This might seem a little easier to stay on top of. You can do it when you want, but then you end up, there's a compulsion, an obsession. The author, which if you read the book about Lost Connection, he actually spent time at the first dedicated rehab for internet and gaming addictions in the U.S. I don't know where that was.
I forget, yeah.
Yeah, I don't. And some of the comments
My guess would be California.
that could be.
Maybe.
One patient in this rehab said, when I feel alone, I hide my feelings using the computer as an escape. When I play an internet team game, I feel happier. Now I do it 14 hours a day. And some of the traits, common traits of the patients at the rehab were anxious or depressed before this issue began. The internet became a way of escaping anxiety. People had been feeling lost and isolated. And he brings up the point that at the time, whenever that was that the internet came, our culture was moving away from community, and it looked as though this internet option was going to be a way to connect, be reinforced, have some status, and it was sort of a perfect storm, really. Yeah. And he says. He makes a statement, we're living in a culture where people are not getting the connections they need to be healthy. Our culture really focuses a lot on the me thing, individualism, so that feeds into it as well. And we have less face-to-face time. And his conclusion is the media cannot compensate us psychologically for what we've lost. And I think what you said is the idea of moderation, using it as a step towards something real.
Right. An actual experience, yeah.
If I can comment on that, I think that's great. That's very interesting. But you're saying let's use social media almost, if you track with me, almost as a form of communication, electronic communication.
Yeah.
Not in replacement of the relationship. Because you kind of can get trapped in, I am not alone, but I'm lonely. There's a million voices out there in social media world, but I'm still so lonely, right? And you're saying, I want to use social media as a connection, a bridge from real life human being to get back to myself, to have interactions with real life human beings.
Yeah.
You can do that. You can use kind of some of this guy who's, gaming 14 hours a day says, I feel like I have a connection when I do this. So he's using that as a bridge, but it may not be the best option to have healthy relationships because there's still no blood, human body component to that.
And just to be aware, we are engaging in social media right now.
Yeah.
This is social media. This
Yeah.
is a podcast. So things like YouTube and podcasting, like this is a very, I think podcasting is one of the more intimate forms because a lot of people are listening in their earbuds or in their cars, and it's like they're sitting, in this chair over here right next to me, listening into this conversation. So, and you can get really valuable things. And just with any source of, food, I think there are levels to depth in different forms of social media. So, if you watched one of Jordan Peterson's 2-hour lectures on the psychological significance of the biblical stories, that's a very deep piece of media you're engaging with. Or if you listen to, a podcast with, Jordan Peterson or Joe Rogan, where they're talking about really deep stuff. That's highly impactful stuff.
Yeah.
Where if you're getting a Twitter comment from some jerk who's like just reacting,
just says, "You suck. This sucked."
right?
Don't
right.
do that anymore.
Just like basically shit talking like that. That's not as beneficial. So it just sometimes I feel like social media gets lumped in, like they just lump it into the same pile, and there are, as Diane says, there's everything's on a continuum, so it's on a spectrum, so it's not all the same. I think and it's not saying like one's better than the other, but they just have they serve different functions, and they can again, like what I said, it's coming at it with a level of intentionality behind it, and that's really been my I've made some adjustments in my own life where I used to just be constantly taking in media,
Tons of
constantly.
stimulation.
Like I would just mow through, audiobooks, a ton of those at work. I'd also listen to I'd always listen to like a podcast or have music going or both, or just, then home would be on YouTube and watching movies and playing video games. So
all
it's
at
like,
the same time.
just like, and it's good. My brain can handle a lot, but now I'm actually, once I got like kind of feeling a little bit more settled in my brain, getting more comfortable with being bored, and then listening to some books that really kind of impacted my thought process about this stuff, is that, hey, buddy.
I know.
Yeah.
I just had a visit.
But it's just like, oh, you don't need to fill the silence every single time. And I see it's a way to regulate that we have these stimulation machines in our pocket, these phones, and then it's like people have gotten uncomfortable with being bored. It's those moments that they just fill with everything.
Yeah.
And I think it can lessen, attention span. And it also, what's funny about doing a podcast is that some people are not comfortable like not looking at their phone and just having,
conversation.
this conversation. It's like, it's uncomfortable just not being able to, like, I don't have my little out to check my email or do whatever it is.
Maybe I just have to be with me, and I just need to notice how I'm feeling.
Yeah.
So I'm really more externally motivated, which can feel safer and more comfortable. I don't want to be with me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Do something else.
Yeah.
Can I comment again back on this guy who's gaming for 14 hours?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because he kind of did the right thing. He kind of said, I'm looking for connection. But it's just applied in a little bit of a sideways way. He's like, I feel like I have connection here. And they said statistically, basically everyone had anxiety, depression issues. So they were trying to solve the problem.
Yeah.
They did solve the problem in a sort of way.
Yeah.
But it's a matter of how do you properly apply that in a healthy context.
And that desire for even, the team cooperation with games or, other internet games. They want to and reward and yay, good job or whatever you get on the gaming thing. But yeah, you're right. There's that desire that we are hardwired, but it's like a mirage.
Well, and it depends on the context. I can speak deeply to the gaming situation.
Yeah, I never played, so I don't know.
We were pretty hardcore in my earlier days. Where like I would actually, what my brother and I would do on Sundays is we'd come home and like hook up Xbox 360s. We both had one, so he was playing in his room, I was playing in mine, and we would play with a squad of my other 3 of my cousins. So it was like a squad of 5, and we're on headsets, and it was amazing. Like we played for 8 hours, but I had deep connections with all those guys I was playing with.
Yeah.
So it was almost like we were a little more together. The other thing is if you take 4 guys and you put them in the same room and they're playing on the same team, playing on video game, like a team-based game, their heart rates sync up, their breath syncs up, and it's like, but that's in real life, you've got to be actually physically in the same room. So a lot of gamers will do what they call like LAN parties where they come and play together. And that's that's actually something where a video game can be a meaningful shared experience because they're problem solving at a high level together and can actually be real. You get into a little bit of a trouble when you play just by yourself late at night on your computer and there's no other humans around. You're not syncing up with anything. You actually need it literally only works if we're all in the same room. Yeah. So I just thought that was interesting.
Right. So it's not black and white. Even some of these concepts that we're presenting, these are just to increase awarenesses, become more knowledgeable about what research is saying, different things like that. To just say, where does this stir me? Where does this affect me? How am I doing? What's going on in my life? Or maybe someone that you know and love is, maybe something here has nudged you for them, and so it's not like, you said it well. It for you, it was a positive experience, and you're on the same page. You've got the same heartbeat. You're friends. It's an activity. 14 hours every day would,
without any
moderation. Back
room.
To what Diane said.
And I will say too, I've gamed by myself, and it's a completely different experience. Yeah. Where like I actually will feel like sad afterwards. Where you're just like, oh, that was completely not fulfilling. Like I was I was distracted, but not fulfilled.
Right. And when Serena comes home, now that you're married and she comes home, if you're gaming all night, that you're missing a lot.
Yeah. Well, I definitely don't do that. Yeah.
Right.
Well, and then that's fun too, because I also, a lot of times I go watch if you're playing video games, and then that's still a shared experience. That's still like,
there you go,
another human interaction.
Yeah.
And I'm the one who's always like, oh my gosh, watch out over there.
Well, it's also like the types of games you play. If you play games that are more narrative, like something that has a huge story arc, a lot of the new ones are like watching a movie, so it can be appreciated by someone who's not playing. Anyway, it doesn't matter. We'll get back to that.
So with all this, how things are, the landscape of the culture, how people are connecting, how we're wired, what happens, what gets in the way. How maybe we could turn towards for a little bit here, just how can we grow connection? How can we, piece by piece, maybe little by little, gain in that network of support, build that net before the crisis comes, before the shit hits the fan, even just increase our sense of well-being.
Yeah.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that? You ask very great questions.
That's a great question.
I'd like to hear.
Well, I think, I think that idea of being realistic. Maybe there's, someone that you'd like to maybe get a little closer to, or just even meet. Maybe say, once a week I'll try to do something, or once a month even. And we've talked also about, people, distressing things have happened in the past. It's, about what's happened to you. Maybe it would help you to have some kind of professional support with somebody who knows about trauma or knows about emotional connection, different things like that. Someone that you feel comfortable with. That could be a place to start. Or read a book, read Lost Connection. there's a lot of awareness in there that you might get. I have a neighbor that was just telling me, she had a long history with an addiction, and her way out, she began to connect with me. We're neighbors, and that seemed safe enough. And then she began to volunteer, and that led her to getting a part-time job. And now she's engaged, involved, having meaningful, kind of giving back.
Yeah.
Some people, I remember back when I was very isolated, I kind of thought maybe if I go to the library and shelve books, now that's not real connecting, but I was trying to make a difference.
You're still contributing.
I was out. I was contributing, something like that. People go to the Y. People maybe find something with a common interest. Jeremy, you mentioned, running, joining, a kind of a group, and even becoming curious when you're with someone. It can be very hard to not think about what's happening inside of you, but maybe to be curious about them, to try to help them out a little bit. He mentions in the book that one of the greatest ways out is to actually help someone else.
Yeah.
Even before, you've got it together, you're healed, and then you make a difference, and you feel like you have meaning and purpose.
And that kind of helping someone else will redirect your attention to whatever it is that you can help them with. So that kind of will take your attention out of your own head and focus it on something else.
Right.
So, and I think, what you mentioned before, just like being more open, and then you mentioned running. I find, at least with the connections that I enjoy, is that the harder the activity, the harder of the set of problems that you're solving with someone, the more intense, the more deep the bond is. So I think when people think about socializing, they think like go out and drinking at a bar, or going out for coffee, or going to see a movie. Some of those activities, it depends if you're having like deep, meaningful conversation and like working through something. But I've had a lot of experience doing really physically intense things with like things like CrossFit, or like the fight gym is a really good example where, we did a lot of like Thai kickboxing, and where it was literally guys that we were punching each other in the face. And like upping our skills together. That was the challenge. And now, I'm doing a lot more jiu-jitsu, which is, submission grappling, where you're, choking each other out and going for arm locks and like attacking each other. And it's really, really physical. You're wrestling these guys and everyone's trying to get better. But like, it's so physically intense. It's so real. There's an element of danger there that we're all like in it to try and get each other. We're testing each other. We're trying to find holes in our games. And it's, those, like, I have some real connections with those guys. Like those are my boys. And like I did it with my brother too, where we trained together, and for various reasons we're not allowed to like spar live because it turns into a real fight and it gets kind of ugly. But it's like we got to keep some boundaries on there. But it's like, because it's so difficult, or like something like hot yoga. That's another one where it's like the community's almost instant. Like once you're in, you're in. Yeah. And it can just be a really once you get used to the
even
skill, regular yoga, I know, like I always say, like the intense things that Serena's always like, real ratchet
just
down.
Settle down.
But I know a lot
just
of
knit
even
together.
like walking your dog with your friend.
Yeah, but my point is, if you have like jiu-jitsu and Muay Thai and those activities are so difficult and so hard that you need the community to help you figure out how to do it well.
Yeah.
And because of how intense the activity is, much like I would have met, and then I'm just speaking way out of turn here, but like combat is super intense and life-threatening, that it just, those bonds are really tight.
Yeah.
So versus someone you just go and see movies with, it's like,
a little different.
how I don't know, like how deep is that bond? Can you really lean on it? Where like there's some guys that I train with and stuff where I would rely on them for like certain things for sure.
Yeah.
Because I've seen them in stressful situations. I've seen like if they're going to freak out or not, and that's more. I don't know if that's more of like a guy thing that I would look for.
And it's very vulnerable too. Yeah. You're being very vulnerable, and that brings people closer, which that doesn't sound real comfortable, but that's part of the bond. That's your whole self, I mean, and maybe I know like our friend Diane Wagenhals, I believe she quilts.
Mm-hmm.
And
Dude,
so
she's good at it too.
She's good at it.
She
and
made us
so
one for a wedding.
Yeah.
and so she might be quilting on her own, and then, but I bet as she's quilting, she's thinking, and then she knows that she's going to be gathering. They have a common hobby, or, just a common thread. I've had some people that I see that have actually worked at volunteered at a food bank, a food pantry, things like that. So, and maybe they go with someone else. And that's the start. I think that sometimes you just need that one other person to go with you to the AA meeting, or go to Celebrate Recovery, or go to that first Al-Anon meeting, and finding other people that have like needs. And I think people do find reputable sites where they can join with other people with some of those common struggles that they have. You may not, they often kind of warn against, getting on a site and then meeting up with somebody face to face that you don't know, they're sort of a stranger. That's something to really be wary of. There's a book that it's a faith-based book. It's called Safe People, but maybe you have a history of, you look at your relationships and you have found them not so safe in terms of they haven't been really good for you. So you have this pattern, like, why do I pick people that hurt me? So, that's a book that talks about what's safe, what's not safe. Even if you've been in relationships, that kind of go along with that, healthy versus abusive. So you guys may be putting a couple of those awareness lists on your podcast site. I don't know how you do that, because I don't know about that technology, but you do.
Yeah.
Some of those ideas.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And I would like to mention as well, I think those are some fantastic steps for people to take when you're really feeling lonely and you're really trying to develop connections. You said this a minute ago and I chuckled in my head. I'm going to bring it back to a very, very, very simple level. Sometimes that's too hard for people. Sometimes, like saying finding one person to go to the meeting with is too much. But you know what? You can start with as small of a step as you need. Getting a goldfish and having a connection to something. Having a house plant. I mean, really, they have studies of, sick people in hospitals and who've been given terrible prognosis, and the ones who have a houseplant to take care of can actually recover or have had more success in recovery than those individuals who did not. They were just stuck in the hospital bed with their thoughts of, I'm going to die or whatever.
I can verify that.
Yeah.
I had a goldfish back in the day when I was 30 years ago, when I was really isolated in a bowl. There was no filter system. He got real big. I don't think he was supposed to grow that big. I think he was 3 inches.
Wow.
And I knew that he was alive. Me and him were in this bowl together called life. And, I think I felt like I kept him alive. He was alive in that bowl for 5 years.
Whoa.
His name was Ted. And if Ted could talk, as they say, it was funny because right about the time that I started to find people one little step at a time, I think they came to me, maybe one person brought a meal, something like that, sat with me for a little bit. Ted died. And honestly, that was sad, but it was almost like the end of the Ted-er.
The next step.
Yeah, like kind of the next step.
Yeah.
As Diane says, people and things are in your life for a reason, a season, a lifetime. So Ted's season had passed.
Yeah, but I think I want to encourage people with that. And thank you for sharing that story too, because sometimes you don't even have I've been there. You don't even have the strength to say, let me call someone. You just look at Ted and you say, you're alive in here and we're in this fishbowl of life together.
If you can make it, I
can make it. I can make it. And I mean, even when I had, not to give too many personal stories about me, when I was really sick and really struggling, you gave me that plant.
I did.
that plant 5 years ago. It was in a little bowl, beautiful little plant, and I had to keep that plant alive. And that plant is alive. That's the plant in my office.
It's huge now.
It's huge now. It's
wow.
the same plant. It's been alive. It's our love fern. For those of you who have
That environment is healthy and blooming.
Yeah.
But those things, they
and that
mean
made
a lot.
I mean, that was like one little plant. With a little thing that grows and it has dirt and you water it once or twice a week, you know?
Yeah.
But that matters, and that helps you to take the next step, and it helps you to do the next thing.
Yeah.
And maybe you can't go out, maybe you don't have a friend, you're so alone and isolated, and you're listening to our podcast alone and isolated in your house or whatever. Like, get yourself a plant.
Yeah.
Ask someone to give you a plant, you know, or
Yeah.
just take care of the weeds outside that are growing. Anything is still forward momentum, and eventually you can take another step and another step, and then you have people and then you have connections, and you say, I can volunteer and stack books at the library.
And maybe if you're in that spot and you've had, you know, some of these hard feelings that we've talked about, maybe talking with a counselor, just having that first person who you just share some of that with is a step. It's not actually a mutual relationship, but it's a helping relationship that can give you some of those early starts to say, okay, let's think about the next step and the next step.
Yeah, and I like what you
That's
said
great.
too about the volunteer thing, because I think that can be less intense for those that don't want to do jiu-jitsu and Muay Thai. Which that's fine. It's fine. Totally fine. But the volunteer thing is usually gauged. It's usually aimed at something that is meaningful.
Yeah.
So you're, even stacking books at the library, there's
Meaningful.
There's meaningful work there, and then a lot of volunteer. It could be like at a food pantry or whatever it is, but you're around people, you're doing something good, and that can be a nice, low barrier to entry situation, because most organizations are looking for just kind of bodies to do things. And
it's less scary because you're not like working, and it's
Right.
not in contract. You're there to offer your time as a volunteer.
yeah.
And you can do it when you feel good, and it's difficult for people that you're not consistently one way or the other. So having that freedom to go for an hour on a better day, and not feel the pressure on a different day. Yeah. And maybe getting a dog.
And I was going
Or
to
a
say that
cat.
too. Honestly, we've talked before when we did our service dog episode. That is one of the reasons that I actually am pro emotional support animal. Because we've talked about this before, emotional support animals have no requirements for training whatsoever, so they should not and do not have public access rights. They cannot come with you into public settings, but they are allowed in housing situations where typically they would say no pets. That's the big public access right that emotional support animals have. And they have a great use because you can have a cat, you can have a dog that you are now responsible for, to care for. You take it on a walk, you change the litter box, those are maybe, like you said, not mutual, but meaningful relationships, helping relationships that help you to develop new connections in different ways. And I think that's fantastic.
And it changes your brain.
And it changes
And
your brain.
You need each other, and you're giving, and there's that mutual love in different ways.
Yep. It's great.
Yeah.
Really helpful.
And I think kind of bringing it back around where we're talking about being kind of proactive in this sense, one of the things that I've noticed, particularly with the messages that get sent, I'll just speak from like the male angle here, is that a lot of times with guys, it's probably less prominent now, and I think where you're supposed to just be strong, don't show any emotion, shove it down. That's kind of getting not as prominent now, but there's a sense of do you guys see March of the Penguins? Do you guys remember that at all? Okay, so it's the emperor penguins that are up in like I think it's the North Pole. But anyway, they come to the same place every year, and it's so barren and just freezing that they have to all cluster together.
Yeah.
And so what happens is they actually will like waddle close together in a almost like a perfect circle. And so they rotate. So like the guy in the middle is the warmest because he's got
Right.
all of the
Body heat.
the penguins around him, and they kind of all shuffle. and they generate heat, and so it's super warm, and then that guy will slowly rotate to the outside, and there's these
So they're always coming in.
there are these horrific storms that just blow, and you've got to take your turn on the outside, and you're taking the brunt of the storm for everybody that's on the inside. So then
That's amazing.
As when I went through, Serena and I went through a rather intense experience through her illness, and with my back going out, and we had a lot of a wonderful compilation of events that then led to my own experience with depression and anxiety. And for me, it was so humbling to have to be the penguin that had to go in the middle. And just being like, no, I'm always the guy on the outside. I'm always the one just taking it. I don't even need y'all. Like, I can do this myself. And
It's cold, but I can do it.
I can just, and then it was just like, okay, I'm gonna die. I need to go on the inside like that. And it's having that. I really think, we want to establish a social network, a robust social network with these deep, meaningful connections. But then, I think part of it particularly is being humble enough to swallow your pride to be like, I need help right now. So I really had to fall back on my deep relationships, on my family, on my close friends. And that's really what, helped me not sink, but so low. So, but it was having it was, I would love to say that I was humble enough to like acknowledge that, but it was more that I just broke and I didn't have any other options. Wow. So
we like shuffled you into the center of the penguin, and then you were like, 2 years later, I can feel my toes again.
be like, that penguin passed out. We should.
Thank you for sharing that. Really.
We got to get a good pack of penguins.
Yeah.
But I think that we feel safer when we're not vulnerable. So we have that self-protective part for good reason, and we develop it early, often. And we don't want to be, under vulnerable could be I feel helpless.
Yeah.
Or I feel powerless. And ultimately they came around you and lifted you up, and it was necessity. You were out of it. You couldn't do it, and you were loved in your vulnerability.
Yeah.
And you can look at those people and say, I know they loved me this way. I know they love me that way. I'm loved. It's okay.
And then understanding that once I take a rotation in the middle, I will get healthy enough to go rotate back out to the brunt of the storm. I will be able to go out and face the chaos again and do that.
Now you've got a pattern, and you'll take your turn going back to the center.
Right, as needed. So.
And we need people. We are hardwired.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We can't do it alone. We think we can, but it doesn't work.
But we really can't.
No, we really can't.
We really can't. So.
Maybe for a short period of time, but then you like what you did, and you're like broken.
It's cold out there, man. Shuffle back to the middle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well,
I think we're
It's pretty good.
Yeah.
We came to the end, I think.
I think so.
Of the beginning.
Yes.
Of the beginning.
Beautiful. I love
the
it.
end of the beginning of of having all of us and all of our listeners to let this kind of percolate.
Yeah.
In our own lives as we go out, as people go out, just kind of noticing, becoming aware, thinking about it. Maybe what's something that it spoke to you about, what's something you might consider doing or even not doing.
Or even not doing it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Dude, Susan, that was awesome. That was
Yeah,
great.
thanks so much for being on.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was a privilege.
Yeah. That was great. We'll have to have you back on in the future. No pressure.
Yeah. If you'd like.
But
An open invitation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's very nice. Thank you.
So awesome.
It was great talking with you guys. I love it.
Well, we super appreciate it. And all right, guys, well, that's it. And we will see you guys in the outro. There you go, folks. You guys, appreciate you all listening, and hopefully you guys enjoyed our lovely conversation with Susan Carpenter. I know I did. That was, I think, definitely one of my faves we've had so far.
It's pretty good.
And
I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Yeah, and that's part 5 of our When Shit Hits the Fan, a Guide to Personal Crisis series, and we'll see. We have at least one more episode planned with this series. We'll see how that goes with the scheduling and so forth, but I think we'll be able to pull it off at some point.
Yeah.
If you guys want any updates and things about our show, check us out on Instagram at The Painter and the Pixie. If I do say so myself, I do a pretty sweet job with the thumbnails for each
they're
week.
awesome. Look pretty good.
So that's worth a looky-loo. And then hopefully in the future we'll have a few other fun things on that account going as well.
Yeah. And where can they find our show notes?
Well, if we do show notes, they're at thepainterandthepixie.com, so you can check that out as well.
Yeah, I've been slacking a little bit on that. I'm gonna get back on top of it. So y'all be able to find those notes there soon.
So we appreciate you guys kind of hanging in there with us with this series. I know some of these topics aren't the most digestible, we'll say.
The easiest to interact with.
Yeah,
They can cause a little bit of stress, and you develop your safety plan. You push pause, you do what you need to do. Take some deep breaths, drink some water.
Yeah, and I think we've engaged and kind of engaged with these topics with the appropriate amount of levity. So it's been
a good show today.
Yeah, appreciate it. So
thanks everybody for listening. I hope that you really enjoyed it. We really enjoyed it.
Yes, and big thanks to Susan Carpenter as well for being on. We really appreciate it. Definitely open invitation to be on in the future. Guys, so we will see y'all next week. In the meantime, y'all relax, be good to one another, and we'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
See you.
Amazing.